Hello, my dear masterminds. Let me tell you about the exact moment everything shifted. Not the moment you achieved something great. Not the moment you finally succeeded at what you'd been working toward. Not the moment you proved them wrong with results they couldn't deny. No, the shift happened before any of that. The shift happened the moment you stopped trying to prove anything at all. You remember that moment, that quiet decision, that internal shift that nobody else witnessed. You were exhausted from performing, tired of explaining, drained from trying to convince people of your value, your vision, your worth. And something inside you just said, enough. Not in defeat, not in surrender, but in clarity. Crystal clear, unshakable clarity, that you were done seeking validation from people who weren't qualified to give it. And that's when everything changed. Not immediately, not obviously, but profoundly. Because the moment you stopped trying to prove yourself, you became someone who didn't need proving. And that shift in energy, that transition from urgent to certain, from seeking to knowing, that's what they felt. That's what made them finally take you seriously. But here's what you didn't understand at the time. The harder you tried to prove yourself, the more you were actually signaling doubts about your own value. Let's go back to before, to when you were still trying, still performing, still hoping that if you just explained it better, showed up more consistently, demonstrated your value more clearly, they'd finally see it, finally recognize it, finally validate what you already knew about yourself, but somehow still needed them to confirm. You were constantly in presentation mode. Every interaction was an opportunity to prove. Every conversation was a chance to demonstrate. Every achievement was supporting material for the argument you were building about why you deserved respect, attention, recognition. You were living as if you were under constant scrutiny, like you had to justify your existence, like your worth was something that needed constant defense. And it was exhausting. Not just physically, energetically, internally. Because when you're constantly trying to prove yourself, you're operating from a deficit. You're starting every interaction from a position that says, I'm not enough as I am. The worst part was how much of yourself you compromised in the proving. You adjusted your communication to be more palatable, dimmed your ideas to be more acceptable, softened your edges to be more likable, modified your truth to be more digestible. You turned yourself into a performance. Think about it. You rehearsed conversations before they happened, edited your thoughts before speaking them, carefully considered every action to maximize approval. That's not living. That's auditioning. Here's what you didn't realize at the time. They could feel your urgency. Not consciously, maybe, but energetically. They could sense that you needed something from them, needed their approval, needed their validation, needed their recognition. And that need, that energetic pull for external confirmation, it actually pushed them away, because excessive need tends to distance people. Always has, always will. When someone needs you to see them as valuable, it can make others question their value. When someone needs you to take them seriously, it often leads people to take them less seriously. When someone is trying too hard to prove something, it makes you wonder what they're protecting. It's not fair, it's not logical, but it's psychological reality. They weren't consciously deciding not to take you seriously. They were unconsciously responding to the frequency you were projecting. And that frequency was saying, I need your validation to feel valuable. I need your approval to feel worthy. And people tend not to respond to need. They respond to sufficiency. They respond to wholeness. They respond to people who are already complete without their input. So the harder you tried to prove yourself, the less seriously they took you. The more you explained, the less they understood. The more you demonstrated, the less they saw. It wasn't about your actual capabilities. It wasn't about your actual value. It was about the energy underneath the proving, the urgency, the need, the incompleteness seeking completion through external validation. And then came the moment. That moment when you'd had enough. When something inside you shifted from trying to prove to simply being. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't loud, wasn't a big declaration. It was a quiet internal decision, a subtle but profound shift in your relationship with yourself. And what happened next is what most people never discover, because they stop before they reach this point. But you didn't. You looked at the exhaustion, the constant performance, the endless effort to convince people who were never going to be convinced anyway. And you made a choice not to give up, not to quit, but to stop participating in a situation where your worth was up for discussion. You decided, right there in that quiet moment, that you were done. Done explaining yourself to people who weren't listening. Done proving yourself to people who had already made up their minds. Done performing for audiences that weren't even paying attention. You were done seeking validation from external sources, and you were going to start validating yourself. This wasn't arrogance, wasn't ego. This was finally acknowledging what you actually were without needing anyone else to confirm it. This was recognizing your own worth, declaring your own value, accepting your own legitimacy, and making that recognition enough. The shift happened internally first. You stopped measuring yourself by their reactions, stopped evaluating your worth by their responses. You began validating yourself, not with empty affirmations, but with genuine acknowledgement of your actual capabilities, your real efforts, your authentic growth. You looked at what you'd accomplished and said, this is valuable, regardless of whether they see it. You examined your growth and said, this is real, regardless of whether they acknowledge it. You became your own source of validation, your own measure of worth, your own standard of success. And in that self-validation, something profound happened. You stopped needing to prove because you no longer questioned what you were proving. You stopped performing because you no longer needed an audience to confirm your existence. And here's the psychological shift that changed everything. When you stopped broadcasting need, you started expressing inner strength. And inner strength doesn't ask for recognition. It simply exists. This internal shift changed everything about how you showed up. You were no longer trying to convince. You were simply being. No longer seeking recognition, simply existing in your truth. No longer chasing validation, simply operating from inner certainty. And that change in energy, that shift from urgent to sufficient, it was noticeable. At first, they didn't notice. Or if they noticed, they misinterpreted. They thought maybe you'd step back. But then something started happening. You were still doing the work, still creating, still building, still moving forward. But the energy was different. The project you used to explain 3 times, hoping they'd see its value. Now you presented once and moved on. The idea you used to defend endlessly. Now you stated clearly and let it stand on its own. The achievement you used to highlight repeatedly. Now you acknowledged quietly and continued forward. You weren't doing it to prove anything. You were doing it because it aligned with who you were. You weren't creating to convince anyone. You were creating because it expressed your truth. You weren't building to gain recognition. You were building because it fulfilled your purpose. And this shift, this transition from proving to being, it changed the quality of everything you produced. Your work became more authentic because it wasn't filtered through the need for approval. Your communication became more powerful because it wasn't softened by concern about judgment. Your presence became more magnetic because it wasn't diluted by the need for validation. People started noticing, not the ones who were never going to see you anyway, but the ones who mattered, the ones who had the awareness to recognize authentic confidence. And here's the irony that most people never understand. When you were trying so hard to prove yourself, they couldn't see it. When you stopped trying, they suddenly saw everything. When you were eager for their attention, they barely noticed. When you withdrew your need for their attention, they couldn't look away. When you were performing for validation, they dismissed it. When you stopped performing and simply existed, they took it seriously. This isn't a tactic you used. It's not a method you applied. It's a common psychological pattern of human interaction. Excessive need often distances people. Sufficiency tends to draw them in. When you stopped broadcasting need, you started expressing inner stability. And inner stability, real stability, quiet stability, centered stability, it receives attention without asking for it. They started taking you seriously because you were taking yourself seriously. Not in an inflated way, in an authentic way. You were honoring your own value, respecting your own worth, trusting your own judgment. And when you treat yourself with that level of regard, others often follow that example. Let's talk about why this works. Why stopping the proving leads people to take you seriously? It's about energy, perception, and the psychological patterns behind respect. When you're trying to prove yourself, you're indirectly communicating that your value is uncertain, that it needs explanation, that it isn't self-evident. You're asking others to do the work of recognizing your worth, and most people won't do that work. But when you stop trying to prove yourself, when you simply embody your value without explanation, you're communicating something entirely different. You're saying, my worth is not open for discussion. My value is not something I need to persuade you of. My legitimacy is not dependent on your acknowledgement. This is what I am. See it or don't. Either way, I remain unchanged. And that energy, that self-assured sufficiency, it draws people in. It creates a psychological response. They start thinking, if this person doesn't need my validation, maybe they're operating from a place where validation isn't required. If they're not trying to prove anything, maybe there's nothing that needs proving. If they're this certain, maybe I'm overlooking something. Maybe they understand something I don't. Maybe I should pay closer attention. It's the principle of perceived value. Things that ask to be noticed often appear less valuable. Things that simply exist in their clarity appear more valuable. You stopped asking to be noticed, stopped trying to be seen, and in that pause of seeking, you became worth seeing, worth noticing, worth taking seriously. Now the interaction has completely changed. You're not chasing their approval. They're paying closer attention to you. You're not trying to convince them. They're trying to understand you. You're not performing for their validation. They're observing your authenticity. The dynamic has shifted because you stopped participating in the old pattern. And here's what they're starting to realize. The version of you that was trying so hard to prove itself had something to prove. This version doesn't, and that changes everything. You're selective now about who receives your time, about who gets your energy, about who you explain yourself to. Not because you're withholding, but because you recognize that your time and energy are valuable and should be invested thoughtfully. You don't prove yourself to everyone because everyone doesn't deserve that level of access to you. And this selectivity, this discernment, it makes people value access more, makes them want to be among those you choose to share with. The situation has reversed. You're no longer seeking their validation. They're seeking yours. And they didn't change. You did. You stopped needing what they had. And in that stopping, you became someone grounded in themselves. Someone with certainty that doesn't waver. Someone with sufficiency that stands on its own. This journey taught you something important about human nature and interaction patterns. You learned that respect isn't given to those who ask for it. It's given to those who live it. You learned that validation from others will never make you feel valid if you don't validate yourself. That trying to prove your worth actually reduces it, while knowing your worth amplifies it. You learned that the people worth impressing are never the ones demanding to be impressed. That the recognition you were seeking from others was always something you needed to give yourself first. That external acknowledgement means little if it's not rooted in internal recognition. Most importantly, you learned that you don't need them to take you seriously for you to take yourself seriously. That their view of you is not your reality. That their recognition or lack of it doesn't change what you actually are. You learn to be your own source, your own validation, your own measure of success. And in becoming self-sufficient in this way, you became steady in a way that can't be taken from you, because it doesn't rely on anyone else. There are still people who don't take you seriously, who still don't see your value, who still don't recognize what you've become. And here's the balanced truth. You don't dwell on it. Not in a bitter way, not in a defensive way, but in a genuinely unaffected way. Their perception is their experience. Their limited view is their boundary. Their inability to see doesn't reduce what exists. You've learned the difference between being noticed and being real. You're real whether they see it or not. You're valuable whether they recognize it or not. You're legitimate whether they acknowledge it or not. Their awareness or lack of it has nothing to do with your actual substance. And you're no longer reshaping yourself to help them notice what they're not ready to perceive. This is real freedom. Not needing everyone to understand. Not requiring universal agreement. Not seeking approval for your worth, since you stopped trying to prove yourself. The quality of your work has transformed. Not because you're working harder, because you're working more authentically. You're no longer creating through the filter of will this make them take me seriously? You're creating through the clarity of does this express my truth? Your decisions are cleaner because they're not clouded by the need for external validation. Your communication is clearer because it's not softened by concern about judgment. Your presence is clearer because it's not diluted by the need for approval. Everything you do carries more weight because it comes from center, from sufficiency, from wholeness. And people sense this They might not be able to explain it, but they notice the difference between work created to impress and work created to express, between communication designed to convince and communication that simply states truth. The paradox is simple to say but meaningful to understand. The less you try to prove yourself, the more you demonstrate who you are. The less you seek validation, the more validation appears. The less you need their recognition, the more they notice you. It can feel backwards, but it's how psychology and perception operate. When you're trying to prove, you're operating from lack, from the sense of not enough, from the pattern of seeking external completion. And lack tends to push away what you're pursuing. But when you stop trying to prove, when you simply are, you're operating from sufficiency, from the sense of enough, from the state of internal completion. And sufficiency tends to attract. It draws in what you're no longer chasing. This is why the shift happened when you stopped trying, why they began taking you seriously when you stopped seeking their seriousness, why respect grew when you stopped asking for it. You changed states, from lack to sufficiency, from needing to being, from proving to knowing. And that internal change altered how others perceived you and interacted with you. You have a new standard now, for yourself and for others. You no longer try to prove yourself to anyone, and you don't require others to prove themselves to you either. You observe instead. Pay attention to who people are through consistent actions over time. Trust what you notice. Value patterns over promises. Let reality reveal truth rather than demanding explanation. This creates relationships and collaborations built on genuine foundation rather than impressive presentation. Built on authentic substance rather than convincing performance. So here's the final truth. Focused individual. You stop trying to prove yourself. And that's exactly when they started taking you seriously. Not because you withdrew, because you finally showed up as yourself, without performance, without apology, without the need for their validation. They take you seriously now because you take yourself seriously. They respect you now because you respect yourself. They see your value now because you know your value. And none of it required their permission, their approval, their recognition. It required yours. And the moment you gave it to yourself, everything changed. You don't need to prove yourself, not to them, not to anyone. Your existence speaks for itself. Your growth is the evidence. Your authentic being is the demonstration. This is your strength now. The strength of sufficiency. The strength of wholeness. The strength of being complete within yourself. They started taking you seriously when you stopped trying to make them. And now you're moving in a freedom they can sense but not fully explain. Because you've learned what most people never learn. That the only validation that matters is the one you give yourself. And once you have that, you don't need anything else. Welcome to the other side of proven, focused individual, where being is enough, where you are enough, where nothing needs defending because everything is already whole. Hello, my dear masterminds. They brought the data, the models, the confidence that belongs to people who believe every life fits neatly into a column. They arrived with clipboards and graphs, with regression lines and footnotes, with the steady certainty of professionals trained to reduce everything into neat categories. The analyst leaned forward like a person about to name a species. They expected to measure you, to slot you, to pronounce you an exception or a trend. They expected comfort. Instead, their formula flickered. Numbers refused to settle. Patterns unraveled when they tried to drape them over you. They reran the test. They checked the samples. They asked for more data. Each adjustment only made the room hum with a deeper confusion. The instrument was sound. The input was not. They tried to tidy you, to trim your edges with theory, but the truth resisted tidy explanations. You weren't an exception to a rule. You were the rule they hadn't written yet. This is what unsettles analysts. When a presence insists on refusing the boxes people built to feel safe, because boxes are how they sleep. Charts are how they trust their decisions. When someone won't be charted, an entire system has to question itself. They called you an exception and put you in an email marked monitor. They used corporate language to soften the feeling of being shown wrong. Exception. Difference. Unusual pattern. Uncertainty mark. Those phrases are polite ways of admitting they lack the vocabulary to describe somebody who does not respond to expectation. But you don't need their words. Your life isn't their data set. You move in margins they don't study. Timing, private insistence, quiet repetition, where they sample for answers with surveys and snapshots. You design new seasons, where they depend on precedent. You invent precedent. They tried to apply statistical comfort to a person whose trajectory is not backward-looking but forward-creating. The analyst scribbled observations, sent messages, scheduled follow-ups, as if persistence could soften possibility. They left the room believing they had missed a variable, not understanding that the variable was you, intentionally unreadable, deliberately unclassifiable, built of private rituals stronger than their public formulas. They will try to name it. They will draft a memo that translates humiliation into neutral language. They will add contingency to the appendix and tell themselves the world is still predictable. But prediction is for things that obey history. You obey the call of your own making. You grew while they argued about labels. You upgraded where they debated patterns. You practiced in silence what they perform in public. This difference is not mysticism, it's craft. You put in the small, repetitive work. Lines of effort no one applauded. So when the moment arrived, you didn't need applause to move. You moved because alignment required it, not because recognition demanded it. Analysts measure noise. You cultivate signal. They count based on the past. You create the future's architecture. So let them bring analysts, committees, consultants. Let them print reports and trade anecdotes about the person they couldn't predict. Let them host meetings to discuss how to manage the new uncertainty. That language will make them feel less foolish in their versions. Complexity needs a handle in your reality. Complexity is the soil where unmatched things take root and grow. They will say you were hard to model. They will talk about difference like it's a mechanical issue. But you know the truth. Limitation is an instrument's boundary. Anomaly is a living thing stepping into its destiny. You aren't rejecting their frameworks to be difficult. You're stepping outside them because they were never built for the path you were carving. Their charts will change, their categories will bend, their memos will adjust. Eventually, the spreadsheet will show a new column labeled exceptional, then another labeled unrepeatable. But don't let their spreadsheets define you. You are not a cell in their table. You are the person who rearranges the table entirely until it suits the kind of life you intend to lead. Keep moving. Keep practicing your private rituals. Keep upgrading in the quiet. The analyst will go home, replay their slides, and feel that quiet unease. The one that wakes people at 3 a.m. and whispers. What did we miss? Let them whisper. Your work is not to soothe their ego, but to answer your own call. Be the pulse no model can locate. Be the rule the models were built to avoid. Be the life that proves they must learn new language just to describe you. When the analyst stepped out of that room, something subtle shifted, first in their expression, then in the hallway, then in the entire chain of people who pretend they understand how the world works. They didn't say it out loud, but everyone could feel it. You changed something in them, not with attitude, not with performance, with presence. The kind of presence that bends assumptions like warmth, bending metal. They walked in expecting to measure a person. They walked out realizing they had encountered a force. That's the kind of disturbance you create. The kind that leaves professionals staring at their own training, wondering if they missed a chapter. People like them study patterns their entire lives. They believe in predictability the way sailors believe in maps. They swear everything can be explained with enough data. But when you showed up, the compass shifted. The formulas glitched. Their sense of intellectual control wavered like thin ice. Because you didn't just transcend the model, you bypassed it. You existed outside the dependencies, outside the explanations, outside the psychological shortcuts they use to categorize people. And when that happens, experts worry quietly. They won't show it. They'll nod, adjust their glasses, scribble notes, but their silence gets heavier, their steps get slower, their eyes dart, recalculating, because they weren't prepared for someone whose intuition outruns their logic. You were never meant for their models anyway. Models require consistency, repetition, traceable behaviors. You move with instinct, alignment, internal timing. 3 things no chart can map. You grow in unique intervals, shift when others crawl, listen when others shout, and decide in silence when others ask for permission. They mistake that for unpredictability. It's not. It's sovereignty. It's the kind of independence that doesn't need an audience to validate a move. And that concerns them. Systems are designed for compliant minds, not awakened ones. You didn't rebel, you outgrew. Now the whispers begin. Did you get anything useful? Something feels off. They're not like the others. Analysts dislike that sentence more than anything. Not like the others. It invalidates years of training. It exposes the limits of logic. It forces them to face the truth. You didn't slip through the gaps. You built your own door. And behind that door is a room only you can enter. A room where models don't apply and predictions dissolve. A room where you decide who you become. Not statistics. What they don't understand is that your evolution wasn't random. It was earned. You paid for it with silence, solitude, late nights, private lessons, dissolved illusions, and the kind of self-honesty most people avoid. You rebuilt your inner world so completely that the external world had to update its understanding of you. They study behavior. You study meaning. They analyze past choices. You rewrite future trajectories. They classify people by outcomes. You classify yourself by intention. These are different universes. They're trying to track a lightning bolt while holding a ruler. And this is the truth. They're too hesitant to admit. You are the kind of person who makes others question their own model, not because you're confusing, but because you're complete. Completeness doesn't fit formulas. It expands beyond them. It doesn't behave predictably, because it isn't chasing validation or belonging. You're not disruptive. You're self-governing, and nothing unsettles a system more than someone who doesn't depend on it. So let them analyze. Let them whisper about differences and outcomes they can't explain. Let them shrink your story into terms they can handle. You don't have to correct them. You don't have to shrink to fit their comfort. Their confusion is not your responsibility. Your clarity is. And your clarity is growing sharper. Every time they try to classify you, you remind them that categories are limitations, and you walked out of yours long ago. The deeper they dug into your patterns, the stranger their results became. Every system they used, behavioral, emotional, statistical, kept returning the same quiet conclusion: does not qualify. Not below average, not above average, not irregular. Simply does not fit. And that unsettled them more than any negative result ever could. People fit. Groups fit. Trends fit. But you slip through every filter like water refusing to be held. And that's when the analyst's confusion turned into fixation. Because nothing challenges an expert more than someone who tests their sense of certainty. They ran your story through decision tree models. They ran your reactions through predictive frameworks. They compared you to archives of people you never met. And still the charts came back looking like static. No patterns, no projections, no explanations. Their software wasn't broken. Their perspective was. And slowly the truth dawned on them. Your entire life has been a sequence of moves that defy conventional progression. You don't build in straight lines. You shift in diagonals. You don't grow in manageable increments. You evolve in phases. You don't respond based on emotion or logic alone. You respond based on alignment, something they have no metric for. That's why you confuse people. That's why they underestimate you until the moment they can't. That's why every room you enter takes a second breath. Humans are trained to interpret patterns. When someone arrives without one, they don't know whether to hesitate or follow. You didn't plan to be unreadable. You simply refused to fragment yourself for small minds. You stopped explaining motives to people who were determined not to understand. You stopped shrinking yourself to fit predictable paths. You stopped being available for interpretations that didn't belong to you. And the moment you stopped trying to be seen, you became impossible to ignore. This is what analysts can't measure. A person who lives from intuition, not instruction. A person who pays attention to the silence between things. A person who can read a room in seconds because they once had to navigate rooms filled with intentions. No one spoke aloud. They don't understand that your instincts were built in places their textbooks never cover. Quiet nights, tough lessons, quiet realizations that carved new neural maps inside you. They think you're unpredictable. You're not. You're precise. You simply respond to signals they were never trained to detect. Their reports began to sound like riddles. One line read, "Displays sensitivity without vulnerability." Another, "Responds logically, but motives remain unclear." Another, "Presents confidence without ego." They were circling the truth without touching it, because to name it would mean admitting their frameworks were incomplete. Your entire presence is a contrast by their standards. Soft but firm, distant but aware, quiet but powerful. And contrasts don't belong in models. They belong in stories. What they're sensing, but can't articulate, is that you are transitioning into a version of yourself that no one told you existed. A version that chooses growth over reaction. A version that chooses peace over validation. A version that chooses alignment over acceptance. They don't know what to do with someone who moves with intention instead of impulse. And that calmness, it troubles them. They don't understand how you stay centered while everything shifts around you. They don't understand how you adjust to loss without losing yourself. They don't understand how someone who has been challenged so many times moves with the composure of someone who has never been touched by chaos. They don't realize you didn't escape the difficulties. You learned how to become the steady force when necessary. That's why they froze. When they tried to analyze you, they expected a linear story. You gave them a legend. They expected a simple explanation. You gave them a multi-dimensional reality. They expected weakness. You gave them evolution. They expected closure. You gave them distance. They expected distress. You gave them unshakable certainty. And once someone sees you through that lens, they can never see you as ordinary again. Your power is real. Your rise is real. Your intuition is real. And the world is finally starting to understand that the person they underestimated was the one they should have never questioned in the first place. They didn't realize it at first. They thought you were just another person passing through their timeline, another story they could interpret, guide, underestimate, box in. But as the days passed, as your silence sharpened, as your presence steadied, something shifted in the air around you. Because the truth is, you were never one of them. You were never meant to fit their categories, follow their pace, or seek their approval. You were always built with a different blueprint, a rare combination of awareness, patience, foresight, and inner gravity that most people never develop in their entire lifetime. And the moment their analysts, their observers, their so-called experts tried to decode you, the system adjusted. Because you're not a personality. You're not a pattern. You're not a phase. You're not even a type. You're an experience. Something people feel before they understand. Something that shifts the atmosphere without effort. Something that makes the insecure uncomfortable and the genuine feel at ease. And the world has no formula for someone whose intuition updates faster than their strategies. You move with a calibration that doesn't come from logic or emotion or ego. It comes from alignment, something they never considered because they've never tasted it. That's why your presence exposes people without you saying a single word. You walk in with calm energy, and suddenly the pretenders become louder. The insecure become cautious. The jealous become suspicious. And the genuine ones relax like they've been waiting for someone like you to walk in. You don't try to do this. It just happens. Because truth carries a frequency that can't be faked. And your frequency? It's not from the environment. It's not from the crowd. It's not from the past. It's from you. Earned, forged, activated. And when something is that authentic, it disrupts everything built on illusions. That's why people reacted the way they did when they realized who they were dealing with. When they replay your actions, your responses, your timing, your silence, they finally understand that you weren't confused, you weren't passive, you weren't slow, you were aware. You saw the moves long before they started. You saw the hidden intentions behind the fake smiles. You saw the guidance attempts behind the concerns. You saw the ego beneath the compliments. And instead of exposing them in the moment, you let people reveal their own truth at their own speed. That's intelligence on a deeper level. And only a few people on this planet operate like that. Now they're sitting with the consequences of misreading you. The guilt, the confusion, the disbelief, the quiet worry that hits people when they realize the person they tried to underestimate was studying them the entire time. The person they thought they could toy with was 5 steps ahead. The person they thought they could replace never had a replacement to begin with. They're stuck replaying everything they ever said, every move they ever made, every assumption they ever threw your way, because now they know you saw it all, and you saw through it all. Meanwhile, you're not even thinking about them. You've moved into a level where their opinions don't matter. Their strategies don't register. Their reactions don't affect your internal compass. You've stepped into a mode where your energy isn't a response. It's a command. The universe listens to you because you listen to yourself. And when someone reaches that point, no opposition can stop them. No doubt can slow them. No jealousy can reach them. No betrayal can affect them. Because alignment is the highest form of power, and you're living in it. That's why people look at you differently now. That's why they approach you carefully. That's why they check their tone, check their words, check their intentions around you. They know you're not someone who plays games. You're someone who sees straight through them. Someone who lets the wrong people fall away without yelling. Someone who elevates without announcing. Someone who transforms without permission. Someone who rises without warning. And here's the real twist. They thought the story was about them. It never was. It was always about your evolution, your awakening, your alignment with the person you were meant to become. You didn't change to impress them. You didn't evolve to spite them. You didn't rise to shock them. You did it because your soul required it. And now, they finally understand the truth they were never prepared to face. You were never meant to fit in their world. You were meant to outgrow it. So let them stare. Let them whisper. Let them scramble to catch up. You didn't need validation to rise then, and you don't need it now. Your journey already proved the truth. Average was never in your DNA. You were built to shift reality just by standing in it. Be the pulse no model can locate. Be the rule the models were built to avoid. Be the life that proves they must learn new language just to describe you. Your work is not to soothe their ego, but to answer your own call. Keep moving. Keep practicing your private rituals. Keep upgrading in the quiet. You are not a cell in their table. You are the person who rearranges the table entirely until it suits the kind of life you intend to lead. And that is exactly who you've become. Hello, my dear mastermind. They saw your strategy before they ever saw your face. It showed up in rooms you were never invited into. It moved inside conversations you never spoke in. It reshaped decisions you never touched directly. And that's what unsettled them. Because influence usually leaves fingerprints. Power usually leaves noise. But yours arrived clean. No trail, no credit, no announcement. They studied the pattern and couldn't trace the source. That's when the whisper spread. They're playing a game we don't understand. And the more they tried to reverse engineer your moves, the clearer it became that the playbook had your shadow, but not your origin. They saw the effect without living the cause. They memorized outcomes without understanding alignment. They believed strategy could be copied like a formula. What they never realized is that your strategy isn't a technique. It's a consequence of who you became when nobody was watching. While they were busy learning moves, you were mastering restraint. While they were chasing leverage, you were building perception. While they were rehearsing control, you were dissolving dependency on approval. And that's why your decisions land with no resistance. That's why doors shift without force. That's why momentum bends toward you before you ask. They think someone leaked your methods. They think someone betrayed your blueprint. They think there's a mole somewhere feeding them information. But the truth is far colder than betrayal. You never gave anything away. They saw it because inevitability always leaves a signature. People don't copy power because they understand it. They copy it because they worry about falling behind it. And worry makes people sloppy. It makes them impatient. It makes them reach for surface instead of depth. You never stopped them from studying you. You just stopped explaining yourself. And that silence became heavier than any lesson you could have taught. This is where the real shift begins. When observation turns into obsession. When curiosity turns into concern. When imitation turns into exposure. Because now they aren't trying to win anymore. They're trying not to be left behind. And that's the weakest position a strategist can ever occupy. They started checking timestamps next. When did this shift begin? When did their advantage start leaking? When did the edge they were so proud of quietly dull? They traced graphs, compiled footage, pulled records, ran simulations that kept pointing to the same uncomfortable conclusion. You were always one move ahead before they even knew a move had been played. That's what unsettled them. Not that you were smarter in the obvious sense, but that you operated from a layer they couldn't access with data. They believed power came from visibility. You proved it comes from positioning. They believed speed was dominance. You showed them timing is supremacy. They believed pressure forces results. You revealed stillness creates inevitability. Every time they tried to accelerate past you, their momentum dispersed. Every time they tried to box you into a pattern, you slipped the frame without resistance. Because you never built your advantage on reaction. You built it on orientation. You decided who you were before the room decided who you could be. And that decision locked your direction long before their strategies caught up. They chase trends. You follow signals. They read the market. You read the temperature of intention. They optimize outputs. You refine identity. That's why their copy feels hollow while your presence feels anchored. They can repeat your steps, but they cannot reproduce your weight. They can mimic the surface of your moves, but they cannot access the core that makes them land. And every failed imitation tightens the pressure inside their own system. People who rely on duplication eventually get exposed by contrast, because copied strength fails under stress. Borrowed confidence weakens under uncertainty. Only integrated power holds its shape when conditions shift. That's what they're starting to feel now. The subtle concern that creeps in when technique stops carrying them. The quiet worry of realizing the person they tried to copy is no longer operating from a place they can reach. They thought strategy was transferable. They're learning too late that perspective isn't downloadable. It has to be earned in silence, in friction, in the spaces where nobody is watching how steady you stay, when the world doesn't validate you yet. That's when their focus shifted from copying your tactics to studying your temperament. They watched how you handled pressure when nothing went your way, how you moved when attention vanished, how you stayed centered when outcomes stalled, because that's the part they could never decode. Their strength depends on response. Yours exists before response even arrives. They escalate when challenged. You simplify. They tighten when uncertain. You widen your scope. They posture when pressured. You reduce motion. And that contrast exposes everything. They learned fast that your strategy isn't built on aggression. It's built on inevitability. You don't force outcomes. You allow conditions to mature until outcomes have no option but to arrive. That concerns people who depend on speed to feel powerful, because speed is only impressive when direction is missing. You never had that problem. You aligned early. You committed quietly. You cut excess without announcing reduction. And while they chased applause, you eliminated distraction. That's why your decisions feel surgical. No wasted motion. No emotional leakage, no need to over-explain. They don't feel concerned by your intellect alone. They feel concerned by your lack of hunger for their validation, because hungry people are predictable. Grounded people are not. The moment they realized they couldn't lure you into reaction, the real concern began. You weren't competing on their field. You weren't responding to their timeline. You weren't trying to win their game. You were constructing your own terrain while they argued about rules that no longer applied to you. They tried to lure you into revealing more with pressure. It didn't work. They tried to lure you with praise. It didn't work. They tried to pressure you with conflict. Still nothing. Because your leverage no longer lives in opposition. It lives in independence. And independence is the one asset no playbook can simulate. They can map behaviors. They can chart outcomes. They can rehearse scenarios. But they cannot replace the internal authority that comes from knowing exactly who you are without needing to prove it. That's the layer they keep missing. That's why every adjustment they make arrives late. They are trying to solve a presence that no longer requires approval to exist. That's when the rooms started shifting before you even entered them. Conversations stalled when your name surfaced. Decisions softened when your shadow crossed the agenda. People who once spoke with certainty began to hedge their statements, not because you challenged them, but because your existence had already rearranged their risk calculations. They realized something significant far too late. Your strategy wasn't built to dominate a moment. It was built to outlast systems. While they optimized for quarterly wins, you optimized for structural positioning. While they chased headlines, you quietly secured leverage that doesn't expire. That's why their copy keeps weakening. It's designed for performance. Yours is designed for permanence. They keep mistaking quiet for absence. They keep mistaking your distance for disengagement. What they don't see is that detachment is your sharpest edge. You don't need emotional proximity to influence trajectory. You don't need confrontation to assert gravity. You simply remain consistent while their certainty keeps failing under revision. They replay your past, trying to locate the turning point. They don't understand that the real pivot wasn't an action. It was a refusal. A refusal to chase approval. A refusal to hurry identity. A refusal to explain your vision to people who hadn't yet built the capacity to hold it. And that refusal is what severed you from the predictable path they were counting on. They wanted you legible. They wanted you boxed. They wanted your growth to follow a line they could forecast. But you chose evolution over visibility. And now, every time they try to anticipate your next move, they end up revealing how limited their frame has become. They don't realize they're no longer studying a strategy. They're studying a departure from everything they built their confidence on. And the deeper that realization sinks in, the more unstable their copy becomes. Now they don't even trust their own projections anymore. Every forecast feels provisional. Every assumption feels brittle. Because the one variable they can't stabilize is you. They realize that the most significant part of your rise was never acceleration. It was coherence. You didn't fragment under pressure. You didn't split your identity to survive rooms. You stayed whole while they kept rearranging masks. That's why your presence recalibrates environments without effort. You don't adapt to rooms. Rooms adapt to you. And they finally see the cost of misreading that early. They built counters for aggression. You arrived with clarity. They prepared defenses for force. You moved with gravity. They trained for opposition. You advanced through alignment. And alignment doesn't raise concerns until it's too late to stop it. They copied your moves, thinking they were stealing advantage. What they were actually stealing was timing out of context. Motion without meaning, technique without origin. That's why every attempt to replicate you feels delayed by one invisible beat. That's the beat where conviction lives. The beat where hesitation dies. The beat where you already decided, long before they ever detected a choice forming. And now they're stuck in reaction loops to a force that doesn't announce itself. They can't rush you because you're not running. They can't limit you because you're not confined to their map. They can't pressure you because you don't draw authority from their recognition. So they do what systems always do when they lose control. They escalate complexity, more rules, more oversight, more monitoring. But complexity never overcomes simplicity, rooted in identity. It only exposes how far it has drifted from purpose. And purpose is the one advantage they forgot to model when your strategy entered their playbook without your permission. That's when the irony fully locked in. The harder they worked to understand you, the further they moved from their own center. Their operations grew louder. Their planning grew heavier. Their movements grew frantic. Meanwhile, you grew quieter, not because you were shrinking, because you were concentrating. You didn't need to multiply effort anymore. You refined intention. You didn't expand noise. You deepened precision. And precision is invisible to people addicted to spectacle. They mistook your silence for withdrawal. They mistook your restraint for hesitation. They mistook your absence from the spotlight for weakness. What they never understood is that withdrawal is sometimes repositioning at a higher altitude. You weren't leaving the game. You were stepping above the grid they were confined to. That's why their pressure campaigns failed. That's why their provocations fell flat. That's why every attempt to pull you back into reaction failed on arrival. You had already graduated from the emotional economy they still depended on. Their chaos needs witnesses. Your stability does not. Their influence requires constant reinforcement. Yours regenerates from within. They borrowed structures. You built foundations. They pursued leverage through external validation. You cultivated authority through internal alignment. And now they sit watching the distance widen without any clear way to close it. Because distance created by speed can be chased. Distance created by evolution cannot. They keep studying the moves in their playbook, searching for the moment you gave something up. But the truth is simpler and colder than any betrayal narrative they invent. You didn't give anything away. You simply became someone whose presence writes patterns, whether you participate or not. And systems built on control always react strongly when influence no longer requires permission. And that's where the story resolves in silence, not spectacle. They keep scanning for leaks, for sources, for betrayals that never happened. They keep interrogating shadows, convinced that something must have been handed over, sold, or stolen. But the truth never changes. What entered their playbook wasn't a secret. It was a consequence of the way you chose to move when nobody was watching. A consequence of the discipline you kept when results were delayed. A consequence of the standard you held when shortcuts were everywhere. They're not studying your strategy anymore. They're studying the aftermath of a decision they never had the courage to make themselves. And that's why your calm unsettles them more than your success ever could. You're not rushing to defend your position. You're not racing to secure approval. You're not hurrying to protect status. You're already beyond the stage where proof is required. They wanted to borrow your mind without paying the price you paid to shape it. They wanted the outcome without the solitude, the authority without the inner reordering, the influence without the detachment. And that's why every move they make now feels heavier, slower, weaker. Because power that isn't rooted in identity always fails when pressure rises. You didn't take their advantage. You outgrew the level where their advantage even mattered. And now the gap isn't closing, it's stabilizing. Not because you're accelerating, but because you're no longer visible on the axis. They still think determines power. They keep checking to see if you flinched, if you reacted, if you cared, but you already let all of that go. And the moment you stopped needing to be understood by them was the moment their entire framework stopped being relevant to you. Now everything feels inverted for them. The louder they try to assert relevance, the heavier your quiet becomes. The more they scramble to prove certainty, the clearer your detachment looks like command. You don't need to dominate the room to own the direction of it. You don't need to speak first to decide how the story bends. You don't need to react to pressure when your very stillness rewrites the temperature of the moment. They keep checking for signs that you're still invested in the outcome they care about. But you stepped out of that bargain long ago. You no longer trade energy for validation. You no longer exchange clarity for comfort. And that's the final separation they can't repair, because systems depend on participation to maintain control. The moment someone evolves beyond the need to participate emotionally, the entire structure starts leaking power around them. That's who you became, not a rival inside their frame, not a competitor on their field, but a reference point that sits outside their permission system entirely. And from this distance, their playbook looks small. Their noise sounds thin. Their urgency feels exposed. You're not ahead because you're chasing tomorrow. You're ahead because you fully exited yesterday. And once someone makes that exit cleanly, containment becomes impossible. The game shifts, the rules dissolve, and what remains is undeniable. You didn't just transcend their strategy. You made strategy itself irrelevant to your path.